The letter was clutched so tightly in his hand that the edges had frayed. But Jedediah Evans couldn't bring himself to care as he paced the dusty platform of the Llano, Texas train station. The spring of 1872 brought with it not just wildflowers to the Texas Hill Country, but the imminent arrival of his mail-order bride from Boston, a woman he knew only through 4 months of correspondence and a single, faded photograph. "You're wearing a trench in my boards, Evans," called Samuel Porter, the station master, who leaned against the doorframe of his office with an amused expression. "Train ain't gonna come any faster with you stomping around like that." Jed stopped pacing and ran a hand through his sandy brown hair. At 32, he'd spent 15 years working his cattle ranch outside of Llano, building it from nothing into something a man could be proud of. The one thing he lacked was companionship. The long, silent evenings in his 2-bedroom house had slowly hollowed him out over the years. "Can't help it, Sam," Jed replied, straightening his best vest and adjusting his string tie. "Never thought I'd actually be meeting her today. Seems unreal." "Margaret Blackburn," Sam said, rolling the name around like he was tasting it. "Fine Boston name. Hope she knows what she's in for out here." Jed had asked himself the same question countless times. Margaret's letters had been articulate, thoughtful, speaking of a desire for open spaces and a simpler life away from Boston society. She'd written of being 28, never married, working as a schoolteacher but yearning for more. Her photograph showed a young woman with bright eyes and a shy smile, dark hair pulled back severely in the fashion of the day. The distant whistle of the train cut through Jed's thoughts, sending his heart hammering against his ribs. The iron beast appeared on the horizon, black smoke billowing as it approached. "This is it," Sam said, pushing away from the doorframe. "Good luck, Jed." The train hissed to a stop, steam billowing across the platform. Passengers began to disembark, a drummer with his sample case, a family reuniting with relatives waiting on the platform, a couple of cowboys returning from delivering cattle in Kansas City. Jed scanned each face anxiously, the photograph in his breast pocket feeling like it weighed 10 pounds. Then he saw her. She stood at the steps of the passenger car, hesitating. She wore a simple traveling dress of deep blue, and her hair, streaked liberally with silver, was arranged in a practical bun. The woman who descended onto the platform was not the 28-year-old from the photograph. She had to be at least 45 or 50, with fine lines at the corners of her eyes and mouth that spoke of years the photograph had not revealed. For a moment, Jed stood frozen as their eyes met across the platform. He saw the recognition in her face, followed immediately by apprehension. She knew that he knew. This was not what he had expected. Jed moved forward automatically, his body carrying him toward her while his mind raced. The woman gripped her small valise tightly as he approached. "Mr. Evans?" she asked, her voice cultured but trembling slightly. "Miss Blackburn," he replied with a nod, tipping his hat. Up close, he could see that her eyes were the same as in the photograph, a warm, intelligent brown, though the face around them had aged. "I'm Jedediah Evans." She began, then stopped, seemingly lost for words. "I believe I owe you an explanation." Around them, the platform was clearing. Sam Porter was watching them curiously from his office window. "Perhaps we should talk somewhere more private," Jed suggested, gesturing to the small depot cafe. "May I carry your bag?" She relinquished it with obvious relief, and he led her to the cafe, where he ordered coffee for them both. When they were seated at a corner table, Margaret Blackburn looked down at her hands for a long moment before meeting his eyes. "The photograph I sent you was taken 20 years ago," she said directly, her voice gaining strength. "I'm 48, not 28. I was afraid you wouldn't respond to my letter if you knew my true age." Jed took a slow sip of his coffee, studying her. The deception stung, certainly, but there was something in her direct gaze, in the way she faced her confession without flinching, that he couldn't help but respect. "I understand if you wish to nullify our arrangement," Margaret continued. "I came prepared to purchase a ticket back to Boston if that's your decision. I won't contest it." "Why did you come all this way knowing I might send you right back?" Jed asked, genuinely curious. A small smile touched her lips. "Because even the smallest chance at a new life seemed worth the risk." Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup. "I've spent my life teaching other people's children, watching them grow and start families of their own. I wanted something that was mine before it was too late." Jed sat back in his chair, taking in everything about the woman before him. She wasn't what he had expected, but there was a dignity in her posture, an intelligence in her eyes that spoke to him. "You know," he said slowly, "you're more beautiful in person." Margaret's eyes widened with surprise. "Mr. Evans, there's no need to—" "I'm not flattering you, Miss Blackburn," Jed interrupted. "That photograph showed a pretty young woman, true enough. But it didn't show the person I've been corresponding with for 4 months, the woman whose thoughts and words have kept me company through the winter evenings. That woman sits before me now. And yes, she's more beautiful than her picture." Color bloomed in Margaret's cheeks, and Jed was struck by how it transformed her face. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll still consider marrying me," Jed replied, surprising himself with the words. "Not today, not tomorrow. We'll take time to know each other properly, face to face. But I'd like you to stay." "Are you certain?" The hope in her voice was cautious but unmistakable. "No," he answered honestly. "But I'd rather find out than wonder for the rest of my life." Outside the cafe window, the train whistle blew, signaling its imminent departure. Margaret glanced toward the sound, then back at Jed. "I'd like to stay," she said simply. The buckboard creaked and swayed as they traveled the 5 miles from Lano to Jed's ranch. Margaret sat beside him on the wooden seat, taking in the rolling landscape with obvious wonder. The Texas hill country in April was a sight to behold. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush carpeted the meadows between groves of live oak and cedar. "It's beautiful," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "So different from Boston." "It can be harsh too," Jed warned. "Summer heat that bakes the ground hard as iron, winter northers that freeze the marrow in your bones. Spring and fall are our rewards for enduring the rest." "Like most worthwhile things in life," Margaret observed. "The difficult seasons make you appreciate the pleasant ones all the more." Jed glanced at her, struck again by the wisdom in her words. "You've been reading my letters for months, but I realize I don't know much about your day-to-day life in Boston." Margaret adjusted her bonnet against the Texas sun. "I lived in a small apartment above a bookshop. The owner, Mrs. Fleming, reduced my rent in exchange for helping in the shop on weekends. I taught at the Girls' Academy during the week, literature and composition, primarily." "You must be well read then." "Books have been my constant companions," she admitted. "Though I find I'm eager to experience more than just reading about life." "What made you decide to become a rancher, Mr. Evans?" "Jed, please," he corrected gently. "My father was a farmer in Tennessee. After the war, there wasn't much left. I headed west with nothing but a mule and what I could carry. Worked as a ranch hand until I saved enough to stake my own claim. The war." Margaret's voice softened. "Were you a soldier?" Jed nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Confederate cavalry." "Not something I'm proud of now, but at 19, I thought I was doing my duty." "Many good men on both sides believed the same," she said without judgment. They crested a small rise, and Jed's ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained house of limestone and timber. A large barn, corrals and outbuildings spread across the property. Cattle grazed in the distance, and a small vegetable garden was visible beside the house. "Welcome to the Broken Spur," Jed said, a note of pride in his voice. "It's not much compared to Boston, but it's wonderful," Margaret interrupted, her eyes taking in every detail. "A real home." As they approached, a lanky young man emerged from the barn. "That's Tommy Wilson, my ranch hand," Jed explained. "He lives in the bunkhouse with Pedro Mendez, who helps with the cattle. Mrs. Wilkins from town comes 3 days a week to help with cooking and washing." Tommy hurried to help with the bags as Jed brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Miss Blackburn, this is Tommy. Tommy, this is Miss Margaret Blackburn from Boston." The young man touched his hat respectfully. "Pleased to meet you, madam. We got your room all ready." "Thank you, Tommy," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "I thought you might like to rest after your journey," Jed said as he escorted her into the house. "Dinner will be at 6. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with solid furniture and clean floors. Jed showed her to a bedroom at the rear of the house, freshly whitewashed with a patchwork quilt on the bed and curtains at the windows. "It's lovely," Margaret said, genuinely impressed with the care that had clearly gone into preparing for her arrival. "Mrs. Wilkins helped with the woman's touches," Jed admitted. "I'll leave you to get settled." Left alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the reality of her situation washing over her. She had traveled over 1,000 miles on a desperate gamble, deceiving a good man in the process. Yet here she was, given a chance she had scarcely dared to hope for. Her hands trembled slightly as she unpacked her valise, arranging her few possessions in the chest of drawers. From a small leather case, she withdrew the photograph, the one she had sent to Jed. 28-year-old Margaret stared back at her, eyes full of promise and possibility. She traced the edge of the image with her fingertip. "What would you think of me now?" she whispered to her younger self. At dinner, Margaret met Pedro, a quiet, dignified Mexican man who'd worked for Jed for 7 years. The meal was simple but satisfying: beef stew, corn bread, and apple pie that Tommy proudly announced he had helped Mrs. Wilkins make especially for Margaret's arrival. The conversation flowed more easily than Margaret had expected. Jed asked about her journey, and she described the changing landscapes she'd witnessed from the train window, the interesting passengers she'd met. Pedro shared stories about the early days of the ranch, while Tommy peppered her with questions about Boston that made her smile. "Do they really have buildings tall as 3 stories?" the young man asked incredulously. "Taller," Margaret confirmed. "And theaters with velvet seats and street lamps that light the whole city at night." "Sounds crowded," Pedro observed. "It is," Margaret agreed. "That's part of why I wanted to come west. Too many people, too little sky." Jed caught her eye across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared values despite their different paths. After dinner, Tommy and Pedro retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving Jed and Margaret alone on the porch. The Texas night was settling around them, stars appearing in a vast canopy overhead. The air was cool and fragrant with spring blossoms. "I never tire of this view," Jed said, leaning against the porch railing. 15 years and it still takes my breath away." "I can see why," Margaret replied, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "In Boston, you can go years without really seeing the stars." "Margaret," Jed began, turning to face her, "I want to be clear about something. When I said we should take time to know each other, I meant it. You'll have your own room, your own privacy. I'm not expecting. That is, until we decide if marriage is right for us." Margaret felt warmth rise to her cheeks, but she appreciated his directness. "Thank you, Jed. That's very honorable of you." "Not honorable," he said with a small smile. just sensible. Marriage is too important to rush into, especially out here where life depends on partners being able to rely on each other completely. May I ask what you're looking for in a wife? Margaret ventured. Jed considered the question. Someone who can stand beside me through good seasons and bad. Someone who brings her own strength to our partnership. He looked at her directly. What are you looking for in a husband? Respect, she answered without hesitation. And the freedom to be myself, not just someone's wife or someone's teacher, but Margaret. Jed nodded slowly. I think those are things we can offer each other, don't you? As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she found herself humming softly something she hadn't done in years. The uncertainty of her future remained, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty held promise rather than dread. The next morning, Margaret woke at dawn to the sounds of the ranch coming to life, roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, the clatter of breakfast preparations. She dressed quickly in a practical skirt and shirtwaist, eager to begin learning about her new environment. In the kitchen, she found a plump, energetic woman in her 60s preparing breakfast. She turned at Margaret's entrance, wiping her hands on her apron. You must be Miss Blackburn. I'm Eliza Wilkins. So pleased to meet you at last. Jed's been talking about nothing else for weeks. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wilkins, Margaret replied, immediately warming to the woman's friendly manner. Is there anything I can help with? Land's sakes, no, you're our guest today. Though I expect you'll want to take over the kitchen soon enough. Every woman has her own way of doing things. I'm afraid my cooking skills are rather limited, Margaret admitted. My apartment in Boston had only a small stove, and I often took meals at the school where I taught. Mrs. Wilkins waved away her concern. Nothing that can't be learned. My Henry always said I couldn't boil water when we first married, but I fed 6 children and a hungry husband for 40 years. Her expression softened. He passed 3 years ago. That's when I started helping at the neighboring ranches. I'm sorry for your loss, Margaret said sincerely. That's life out here, Mrs. Wilkins replied, but her eyes held a momentary sadness. Now you sit yourself down. The men will be in soon, hungry as bears. Throughout breakfast, Margaret observed the easy camaraderie between Jed and his workers. There was respect in their interactions, but also genuine affection. When Tommy spilled coffee, Jed merely tossed him a cloth without comment. When Pedro mentioned a fence that needed mending, Jed immediately included it in the day's plans. Would you like a tour of the ranch today? Jed asked Margaret as they finished eating. I need to check the north pasture, but we could ride out together. I'd like that very much, Margaret replied, though I should warn you, it's been many years since I've been on a horse. Daisy's gentle as a lamb, Tommy assured her. She's the horse we let the children ride when families visit. An hour later, Margaret found herself astride a placid chestnut mare, following Jed along a trail that wound through the property. Despite her initial nervousness, she quickly remembered the riding lessons of her youth, and soon was comfortable enough to take in the beauty around her. Jed pointed out landmarks as they rode the creek that provided water year-round, the best grazing meadows, the wooded area where deer could often be spotted at dawn and dusk. He spoke with knowledge and passion about his land, and Margaret found herself captivated by his obvious connection to this place. How many cattle do you run? She asked as they paused atop a rise overlooking a valley where 100 or more animals grazed. About 400 head, Jed replied. Not the biggest spread in the county, but enough to make a good living. We drive them to market in San Antonio twice a year. He glanced at her. Ranch life isn't easy, Margaret. The work never really ends. No worthwhile endeavor is without challenges, she replied. Teaching has its own endless demands. Tell me about your students, Jed said as they continued riding at a leisurely pace. Margaret's face brightened. They were remarkable young women, most of them, eager to learn, full of questions about the world. I taught girls from 12 to 18, primarily literature and composition, though I filled in for other subjects when needed. You miss them, Jed observed. I do, she admitted, but I've taught for 25 years. I've seen hundreds of girls grow into women, marry, have children of their own. Some have even sent their daughters to my classroom. She looked across the Texas landscape. I was ready for something new. Would you want to teach again? Llano has a small school. They're always looking for qualified teachers. Margaret considered this. Perhaps someday. For now, I'd like to learn about this place, about ranching. If I'm to be part of your life, I want to understand all aspects of it. Jed's expression warmed. I'd like that. They stopped by a small stream for a rest, dismounting to let the horses drink. Jed spread his coat on a flat rock for Margaret to sit on, then settled beside her. May I ask you something personal? He ventured after a comfortable silence. Of course. Why did you never marry in Boston? From your letters, you seem like someone who values family. Margaret looked out at the flowing water, gathering her thoughts. I almost did once. His name was Robert, a professor at the men's college where my father taught. I was 23, he was 30. We were engaged for 6 months. She paused. Then my father died suddenly. My mother needed care and my salary was essential. Robert wasn't willing to take on those responsibilities. He wanted a wife who could devote herself entirely to advancing his career. He sounds like a fool, Jed said quietly. Margaret smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps just a man who knew what he wanted. After that, I focused on my teaching and caring for my mother until she passed 10 years ago. By then, I was approaching 40, considered firmly on the shelf. I had my students, my books, my small circle of friends. It seemed enough. Until it wasn't, Jed supplied. Until it wasn't, she agreed. When I saw your advertisement in the newspaper, she broke off, looking slightly embarrassed. When you saw my advertisement, he prompted gently. It spoke of wanting a partner, not just a wife, someone to build a life with. It made me wonder if perhaps it wasn't too late after all. Her fingers twisted in her lap. That's when I made the decision about the photograph. I told myself it was just to get your attention, that I would explain in person. She met his eyes directly. It was wrong of me, and I'm truly sorry. Jed reached over and briefly covered her hand with his. We all make choices we regret, Margaret. The question is what we do afterward. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Come on. There's something else I want to show you before we head back. He led her through a grove of trees to a small, sheltered meadow. It was filled with wildflowers of every color: bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, Mexican hat, and dozens Margaret couldn't name. Oh, she exclaimed, delighted. It's like something from a poem. I found this place my first year here, Jed said, watching her reaction with pleasure. It's hidden enough that the cattle don't graze it down. Every spring it comes back like this. Margaret moved among the flowers, bending occasionally to examine a particular bloom. Jed stayed back, giving her space to explore. When she turned back to him, her face was alight with simple joy. Thank you for sharing this, she said. I've never shown it to anyone else, he admitted. The significance of his words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something shift in her heart, a tentative opening, like a flower turning toward the sun. The days began to take on a rhythm. Each morning, Margaret rose early to help with breakfast, learning from Mrs. Wilkins on the 3 days she came to the ranch, managing on her own the rest of the time. Her first attempts at biscuits were disastrous, hard as rocks. Tommy had declared, though he'd eaten them anyway, but she improved quickly under Mrs. Wilkins' patient guidance. In the afternoons, she often accompanied Jed on his rounds of the ranch, gradually becoming more confident on horseback. When he was busy with tasks that required his full attention, she explored the house and its surroundings, started a small herb garden beside the vegetable plot, or read from the modest collection of books on the parlor shelves. Evenings were her favorite time. After dinner, she and Jed would sit on the porch, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes simply enjoying the night sounds and each other's company. They spoke of their childhoods, hers in a professor's household in Boston, his on a struggling farm in Tennessee. They discovered a shared love of poetry. Margaret was delighted to learn that the rugged rancher could recite Wordsworth and Tennyson from memory. "My mother," Jed explained when she expressed surprise. "She taught school before she married my father. Always had a book in her apron pocket, even while churning butter or kneading bread. She'd recite poems while she worked, and I picked them up without really trying." 2 weeks after Margaret's arrival, Mrs. Wilkins invited them to Sunday dinner in town, along with several other ranching families. It would be Margaret's first real introduction to Llano society, such as it was. "Are you nervous?" Jed asked as they drove the buckboard toward town that Sunday. "A little," Margaret admitted. "First impressions are important, and I'm aware that our situation is unconventional." Jed's hands were steady on the reins. "The good people of Llano have plenty of opinions, that's certain, but they're fair-minded for the most part. Judge a person by their actions, not their circumstances." The Wilkins home was modest but welcoming, with a large table set up in the main room to accommodate the guests. Besides Jed and Margaret, there were the Fosters, who ranched to the south of Broken Spur, the Richardsons, who owned the general store, Reverend Davis and his wife, and Sam Porter, the station master, and his daughter Emily, Mrs. Wilkins made the introductions with obvious delight in her role as hostess. "And this is Miss Margaret Blackburn, recently arrived from Boston. She's staying at Broken Spur while she and Jed get acquainted." There was a moment of curious silence as the assembled company assessed Margaret. She stood straight, meeting their gazes with a calm dignity. Mrs. Foster, a handsome woman in her 50s, was the first to step forward. "Welcome to Llano, Miss Blackburn. We're always pleased to have new faces, especially those with stories from back east. Do join me after dinner. I'm desperate for news of the latest fashions." "I'm afraid I'll disappoint you there, Mrs. Foster," Margaret replied with a smile. "I've never been particularly fashionable." "Nonsense. You have a Boston air about you. That counts for something in these parts." The ice thus broken, the others came forward with greetings. The only exception was Emily Porter, who gave Margaret a cool nod before turning her attention exclusively to Jed. Margaret noticed how the young woman, perhaps 22 or 23, positioned herself at Jed's elbow throughout the pre-dinner conversations, laughing a bit too enthusiastically at his mild jokes. During dinner, Margaret found herself seated between Reverend Davis and Mr. Richardson, engaged in a pleasant discussion about books available through the general store. "I'm thinking of expanding our selection," Mr. Richardson was saying. "With the railroad making deliveries more reliable, we could stock a better class of literature. Perhaps you could advise me, being a teacher." "I'd be delighted," Margaret replied. "There are several publishers producing affordable editions of classics now, and some excellent contemporary authors worth considering." From across the table, she caught fragments of conversation between Jed and Emily. The young woman was leaning close, speaking in low tones. "Don't know why you'd settle for." Emily's words drifted over before Mrs. Foster's louder voice drowned them out. Margaret kept her expression pleasant, but inside, a familiar doubt began to curl through her thoughts. What was she doing here, pretending she could start a new life at her age? Emily Porter was young, pretty, clearly interested in Jed. Wasn't that the more natural match after dinner? While the men moved to the porch to smoke, the women gathered in the kitchen to help with dishes and exchange gossip. Margaret rolled up her sleeves and picked up a towel, ready to dry the plates Mrs. Wilkins was washing. "No need for that, Miss Blackburn," Emily said, stepping forward to take the towel. "You're our guest. Why don't you rest? These chores must be quite taxing at your age." There was a pointed silence. Mrs. Wilkins shot Emily a disapproving look, but Margaret merely smiled. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Porter, but I assure you I'm quite capable. I've found ranch work to be invigorating, actually. There's something deeply satisfying about tangible results, don't you think? After years of dealing with the abstractions of education, I find great pleasure in seeing a clean plate, a rising loaf of bread, or a weeded garden row." She took back the towel gently but firmly. Emily retreated, flushing slightly. Mrs. Foster chuckled. "Well said, Miss Blackburn. Emily, dear, perhaps you could fetch the pie from the pantry." As the young woman left the room, Mrs. Richardson leaned closer to Margaret. "Don't mind Emily. She's had her cap set for Jed Evans for years. Never made any headway, though. Jed's always been particular." "I'm not concerned," Margaret said, though the reassurance was as much for herself as for the others. "Jed and I are still becoming acquainted. No commitments have been made." "That's not the impression he gave at the barber shop yesterday," Mrs. Wilkins commented, her eyes twinkling. "Henry Jackson said Jed was in there getting a proper trim, talking about how he'd never expected to find someone who could quote Shakespeare and bake a decent pie, even if the first few were hard as rocks." The women laughed, and Margaret felt a warm glow at the thought of Jed speaking about her to others. The moment was interrupted by Emily's return with the pie, and conversation shifted to other topics. Later, as Jed and Margaret drove home under a sky brilliant with stars, she felt a new contentment settling around her. The ranch was beginning to feel like home, and the people of Lano, despite Emily Porter's coolness, had been welcoming. "You were a hit," Jed said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Mrs. Wilkins told me everyone was impressed by your grace and intelligence." "Everyone except Miss Porter," Margaret observed wryly. Jed glanced at her, then back at the road. "Emily's father and I have done business together for years. I think he's given her the impression there might be more between us someday." "And might there be?" Margaret asked, keeping her tone light though her heart had begun to beat faster. "No," Jed said simply. "Emily is a fine young woman, but we have nothing in common beyond living in the same town." He hesitated. "Besides, my interests lie elsewhere." The words hung in the air between them, full of possibility. "I see," Margaret said softly. When they reached the ranch, Jed helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Standing close in the darkness, Margaret could smell the clean scent of his soap, feel the warmth of him just inches away. "Margaret," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I've been thinking." "Yes." Her own voice seemed to come from far away. "Tomorrow's my birthday. 33. I'd like to take you somewhere special if you're willing." It wasn't what she had expected him to say, but the sincerity in his voice touched her. "I'd like that very much." "Good." He stepped back slightly. "We'll leave after breakfast. Bring a hat, it's a bit of a ride." That night Margaret lay awake, her thoughts too active for sleep. In just a few weeks, her life had transformed completely. She had expected to be on her way back to Boston by now, rejected for her deception. Instead, she found herself falling into the rhythms of ranch life with surprising ease and, more alarmingly, falling for the rancher himself. Jed Evans was not what she had expected. Behind his capable, sometimes stern exterior was a thoughtful man with depths she was only beginning to discover. The way he recited poetry in his deep Texas drawl, the gentleness with which he treated the weakest calf in his herd, the respect he showed to Pedro, unlike many ranchers' attitudes toward Mexican workers, the patience with which he answered her endless questions about ranching. And there was the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice a look of wonder and growing affection that made her feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in her life. But doubt still nagged at her. Was she being foolish? At 48, was she too old to begin again, too set in her ways to adapt to life as a rancher's wife? And what of Jed? Would he wake up one day and regret choosing a woman 20 years older than he'd expected? Morning came before she had answers, but it brought with it the anticipation of the day ahead. She dressed carefully in her most practical riding clothes and packed a small bag with extra stockings and a shawl, unsure what Jed had planned. Breakfast was a cheerful affair, with Tommy presenting Jed a carved wooden horse as a birthday gift and Pedro offering a hand-tooled leather belt. Margaret felt a moment's panic that she had nothing to give, but Jed seemed genuinely touched by her heartfelt birthday wishes. After the meal, Jed brought 2 horses to the front of the house, his own sturdy gelding and Daisy, the gentle mare Margaret had been riding. "We'll be gone overnight," he explained as he secured their bags to the saddles. "Pedro and Tommy will look after things here. Overnight." Margaret repeated, suddenly nervous. "There's a line shack about 4 hours' ride from here," Jed said. "It's basic but comfortable. We'll have complete privacy." The implications of his words weren't lost on Margaret. Her cheeks warmed and she busied herself adjusting her hat. "If you're uncomfortable with the arrangement," Jed added quietly, "we can make it a day trip instead." "No," Margaret said, finding her resolve. "I trust you, Jed, and I'm curious to see more of your land." They set off as the morning sun was climbing in the sky, heading northwest across terrain that grew progressively more rugged. Jed pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the early days when he'd first staked his claim, sleeping under the stars while building his house piece by piece. "Weren't you afraid all alone out here?" Margaret asked. "Terrified," Jed admitted with a laugh. "Every coyote howl had me reaching for my rifle the first month, but there's something about facing your fears that makes them smaller." By the second year, this place felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived. They stopped at midday beside a clear spring bubbling up from between rocks. Jed produced bread, cheese, and apples from his saddlebag, spreading his coat on the ground for them to sit on. "This is lovely," Margaret said, looking around at the wildflowers growing near the water's edge. "I never imagined Texas would be so beautiful." "Most people don't," Jed replied. "They expect desert and dust. The hill country is Texas's best-kept secret." He watched as she trailed her fingers in the cool water. "You're adapting well to ranch life." "I'm enjoying it more than I expected," she admitted. "There's a realness to the work that's deeply satisfying. In Boston, success was measured by social connections, appearances, abstract achievements. Here, you either fixed the fence or you didn't. The bread rises or it falls. There's honesty in that," Jed nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's what drew me to ranching. No pretense, just honest work and its rewards." He hesitated, then added, "and its challenges." "Life out here isn't always springs and wildflowers, Margaret. There are droughts that crack the earth and kill the cattle, blizzards that freeze a man in his saddle, months when every day is a fight to survive." "You're warning me again," Margaret observed. "I want you to have clear eyes about what you're considering," Jed said. "This isn't a decision to make lightly." "Nor am I taking it lightly," she replied. "I may be new to ranching, but I'm not new to hardship or hard work, Jed. Teaching isn't all books and quiet classrooms. It's breaking up fights between boys twice your size, nursing children through epidemics that claim half the class, arguing with parents who think education is wasted on their daughters. Her passionate response seemed to both surprise and please him. "Fair point," he conceded. "I shouldn't underestimate you." "No," she agreed with a small smile. "You shouldn't." They continued their journey through the afternoon, climbing higher into the hills. The landscape grew more dramatic: limestone bluffs, deep canyons, ancient oak trees twisted by centuries of wind. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge and Jed reined in his horse. "There it is," he said, pointing to a small cabin nestled in a grove of trees beside a meandering creek. "Not much to look at, but it's sturdy." The line shack was indeed modest, a single room built of logs with a stone chimney, a small corral for horses, and a lean-to for firewood. But as they approached, Margaret could appreciate its picturesque setting. The creek gurgled nearby, wildflowers dotted the clearing, and the surrounding hills created a sense of peaceful isolation. Jed helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "I'll see to the horses if you'd like to look around inside. There should be supplies on the shelves." The cabin's interior was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs nearby. A narrow bed stood against the opposite wall, covered with a wool blanket. Shelves held basic provisions: coffee, beans, salt pork, flour, sugar. A Dutch oven and a few cooking implements hung from hooks. Margaret moved about the space, touching the items with growing curiosity. This was where cowboys stayed when working the distant parts of the ranch, a masculine domain where few women ever set foot. Yet she felt strangely at home in its simplicity. She was examining a set of antlers mounted above the door when Jed entered, carrying their saddlebags. "The horses are settled," he said, setting their belongings on the table. "What do you think?" "It's charming in its way," Margaret replied honestly. "I can see why you wanted to show me this place." "That's not the only reason I brought you here," Jed said. "Come outside. There's something else." He led her around the cabin and up a small rise behind it. At the top, they faced west, where the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The view was spectacular: rolling hills stretching for miles, painted in the gold and amber light of late afternoon. "This is what I wanted you to see," Jed said softly. "The most beautiful sunset in Texas." They stood side by side as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky transformed from blue to gold, then to a fiery orange that set the clouds ablaze. Margaret found herself holding her breath at the beauty of it. "I've never seen anything like it," she whispered. "Nor have I," Jed replied, but when she turned, she found he wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking at her in the golden light. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. Without thinking, Margaret reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers light against his skin. Jed caught her hand and turned it, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. The simple gesture sent warmth spiraling through her. "Margaret," he said, his voice low, "I brought you here because this is my favorite place on the whole ranch, the place where I come to think, to make important decisions." He took both her hands in his. "I know it's only been a few weeks. I know we agreed to take time, but I'm not a man who hesitates when he knows his mind and heart." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What are you saying, Jed?" "I'm saying that I don't care about photographs or age or any of that. I care about the woman who quotes Wordsworth while collecting eggs, who keeps trying until she gets the biscuits right, who faces down Emily Porter with grace and dignity." His grip on her hands tightened. "I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Blackburn, and I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife, not someday, but soon." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Oh, Jed, are you certain? I'm still 20 years older than you expected. That won't change." And I'm still the man who told you on the very first day that you're more beautiful in person, he replied steadily. That hasn't changed either. As the last light of day gilded the hills around them, Margaret gave him her answer in the form of a kiss, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. Jed's arms came around her, drawing her close against the cooling evening air. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Jed rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Margaret whispered, her heart too full for more elaborate words. "Yes, it is." They stood together until the first stars appeared, wrapped in the knowledge that they had found in each other something neither had expected, but both had sought a partner for the journey ahead, whatever it might bring. Back in the cabin, Jed built a fire while Margaret prepared a simple meal from the provisions. They worked in comfortable harmony, moving around the small space as if they'd done so for years. Over dinner, they spoke of practical matters: when they might marry, what changes would come to the ranch, how to tell their news to the people of Lano. "I'd like a simple ceremony," Margaret said. "Perhaps just Reverend Davis with your ranch hands and a few friends as witnesses." "Whatever you want," Jed agreed. "Though I suspect Mrs. Wilkins will be disappointed if she can't fuss over the preparations a little." "We can certainly let her bake the cake," Margaret conceded with a smile. "I've learned enough about my own baking skills to know my limitations." After they'd washed the dishes together, a new awareness settled between them. The single bed seemed suddenly prominent in the small room. "I can sleep outside by the fire," Jed offered, sensing her uncertainty. "We may be engaged now, but I meant what I said about honoring your privacy until we're properly married." Margaret considered his words, then shook her head slowly. "That won't be necessary. I trust you, Jed, and it's a cool night." The intimacy they shared that night was gentle and reverent, holding each other close beneath the wool blanket, exchanging soft kisses and whispered confidences as the fire burned low. Jed treated her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes, and Margaret found herself shedding the self-consciousness that had plagued her for years about her aging body. "You really do find me beautiful, don't you?" she whispered in the darkness. "More every day," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Age is just a number, Margaret. It's the soul that matters, and yours is the most beautiful I've ever known." They returned to the ranch the next day, both quiet with the depth of what had passed between them. Tommy and Pedro noticed the change immediately, exchanging knowing glances when Jed announced that they would be married at the end of the month. "About time, boss," Pedro said with a rare smile. "Miss Margaret belongs here. Does this mean we get cake?" Tommy asked practically, making them all laugh. The news spread quickly through Lano. Most reactions were positive. Mrs. Wilkins was indeed delighted to be asked to bake the wedding cake, and Sam Porter offered the use of the depot garden for the ceremony, as it was the prettiest spot in town. Not everyone was pleased, of course. Emily Porter stopped speaking to both of them, and there were whispers among some of the townspeople about the unusual match. But Margaret found she cared less about such things than she once would have. The confidence that came from being truly loved gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. 2 days before the wedding, a letter arrived from Boston, a response to one Margaret had sent to her closest friend shortly after accepting Jed's proposal. She took it to the shade of the oak tree behind the house to read in privacy. "My dearest Margaret, I confess your letter left me first astonished, then delighted. To think that my cautious, practical friend has found romance in the wilds of Texas. It reads like one of those novels we used to giggle over as girls. I can hear your voice asking, 'But is it sensible, Elizabeth?' To which I say, when has love ever been sensible? You have spent your life being rational and responsible." Perhaps it's time to follow your heart without questioning it quite so thoroughly. As for the age difference that concerns you, I will say only this. My own dear William was 15 years my junior, and we had 23 blissful years together before his passing. Age matters far less than character, compatibility, and mutual respect. The school misses you terribly, though Miss Hamilton is doing her best with your classes. The girls ask after you often. I've told them you've gone on a grand adventure, which seems to satisfy most of their curiosity. Write when you can. I long to hear every detail of your new life. With all my affection, Elizabeth. The letter brought both comfort and a pang of homesickness for the friend she might never see again. Yet it also reinforced Margaret's conviction that she was making the right choice. Elizabeth had always been her wisest counselor, and her blessing meant a great deal. Margaret was folding the letter when she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she saw Jed coming toward her, his expression troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked as he reached her. "Nothing to worry about," he said, sitting beside her on the bench beneath the tree. "Just got word that the Comanche have been spotted about 30 miles north of here. Army's tracking them, but I've asked Pedro to keep a closer eye on the herd for the next few days." Margaret's hand went to her throat. "Is there danger?" "Not likely," Jed assured her. "They haven't raided this far south in years. It's just a precaution." He nodded toward the letter in her lap. "News from Boston, from my friend Elizabeth," Margaret confirmed. "She sends her congratulations and some reassurance about our age difference." "Smart woman," Jed said with a smile. Then, more seriously, "Are you having second thoughts, Margaret?" "No," she said firmly, "but I'd be lying if I said I never worry about it. Not for myself, I'm exactly where I want to be, but for you, Jed, I'll be an old woman while you're still in your prime." "We all age," he said simply. "Some just have a head start." He took her hand in his. "I've thought about it too, you know. But here's what I realized. There are no guarantees in life, Margaret. A young wife could be taken by childbirth or fever. I could be thrown from a horse tomorrow. Out here, we learn to value each day we're given, not worry about ones that may never come." Margaret squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "You're right, of course. I'm being foolish." "Not foolish," he corrected gently. "Just human." He stood, pulling her to her feet. "Now come see what just arrived from San Antonio." Mrs. Wilkins is beside herself with excitement. In the kitchen, they found Mrs. Wilkins unwrapping a package that contained fine white sugar, vanilla beans, and other baking supplies for the wedding cake. "It's going to be the finest cake Lano has ever seen," she declared. 3 tears. "Though I had to promise Henry Jackson 2 pieces to get him to bring these special from his last supply run." The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparations. Margaret sewed ribbon trim onto her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the silver in her hair, while Jed had a new shirt and string tie delivered from the general store. Tommy swept the yard until Mrs. Wilkins told him he'd wear out the ground, and Pedro polished the buckboard until it gleamed. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and mild, with just enough breeze to stir the leaves of the oak trees. Margaret woke early, watching the sunrise from her bedroom window, the last time she would sleep in this room as an unmarried woman. Tonight, she would move to Jed's room at the other end of the house, beginning their life together properly. Mrs. Wilkins arrived with the sun, bringing her daughter Clara to help Margaret prepare. They heated water for a bath, arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than her usual practical bun, and helped her dress in the blue gown with its new trim. "You look radiant," Clara said, standing back to admire their work. "Blue is definitely your color." "Jed won't know what hit him, Mrs." Wilkins agreed, dabbing at her eyes. "Now, I need to check on that cake one last time before we leave for town." Left alone briefly, Margaret studied her reflection in the small mirror. The face that looked back at her was lined with the years she'd lived, her hair more silver than brown now. But her eyes were bright with happiness, her cheeks flushed with anticipation. She looked, she realized, like a woman in love, ageless in that moment. The journey to town was festive, with the buckboard decorated with ribbons and wildflowers. Tommy rode ahead on horseback, too excited to sit still in the wagon, while Pedro drove with dignity, his best hat set at a precise angle. Jed rode alongside, handsome in his new shirt, occasionally catching Margaret's eye with a private smile that made her heart skip. The depot garden had been transformed. Lanterns hung from tree branches, benches had been arranged in rows, and a simple arch of greenery marked the spot where they would exchange their vows. To Margaret's surprise, it seemed most of Lano had turned out for the occasion, ranching families from miles around, shopkeepers, the school teacher and her pupils, even travelers waiting for the afternoon train. "I didn't expect so many people," she whispered to Jed as they walked toward the arch where Reverend Davis waited. "News travels fast in small towns," he replied, "and a wedding is the best entertainment around." His hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Ready, more than ready," she assured him. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and steady. When Reverend Davis pronounced them husband and wife, Jed's kiss was tender but unmistakably passionate, drawing cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the crowd. The celebration that followed was lively. Mrs. Wilkins' magnificent cake was cut and shared, fiddle music inspired dancing, and congratulations poured in from friends and neighbors. Even Sam Porter offered sincere good wishes, though his daughter was noticeably absent. As the afternoon waned, Margaret found a quiet moment with Mrs. Wilkins. "Thank you for everything," she said, embracing the older woman. "I don't know what I would have done without your guidance these past weeks." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilkins replied, though she returned the hug warmly. "You'd have managed just fine, but I'm glad to have been part of it." She lowered her voice. "And I'm glad Jed finally found someone worthy of him. That man has been alone too long." As they prepared to leave, a commotion at the edge of the gathering caught their attention. A group of riders had arrived, dusty from the trail. At their head was a U.S. Army lieutenant, his uniform disheveled. "Evans," he called, spotting Jed in the crowd. "Need a word." Jed excused himself and went to meet the officer. Margaret watched their conversation with growing concern. The lieutenant's expression was grave, Jed's responses short and serious. After a few minutes, Jed returned to her side. "What is it?" she asked. "The Comanche raiding party," he said quietly. "They've hit the Franklin place about 15 miles north. Army's forming a volunteer group to track them before they strike again." His eyes held regret and determination. "I have to go, Margaret." Veer clutched at her heart, but she forced herself to nod. "Of course you do. When?" "Now." "They're waiting." He took her hands in his. "I'm sorry. This isn't how our wedding day was supposed to end." "Go," she said firmly. "Do what you must. But come back to me, Jedediah Evans." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he promised, kissing her once more before striding toward his horse. Margaret watched as Jed conferred briefly with Pedro, who would stay to protect the ranch, then mounted up to join the army patrol. As they rode out, Jed turned back once, raising his hand in farewell. Margaret lifted her own in response, holding her fear inside until the riders had disappeared from view. "He'll be fine, Mrs. Evans," Mrs. Wilkins said, coming to stand beside her. "Jed knows this country better than anyone, Mrs. Evans," Margaret repeated softly, the new name unfamiliar on her lips. "Yes, I believe he will be." The return to the ranch was subdued. Pedro drove the buckboard with Margaret, Mrs. Wilkins, and Tommy, all lost in their own thoughts. At the house, Mrs. Wilkins insisted on staying until Jed returned. "I won't hear of you being alone tonight," she said firmly. "It's not right for a bride to be by herself on her wedding night, even under these circumstances." Margaret was secretly grateful for the company. The thought of spending her first night as Jed's wife alone in the empty house was unbearable. Instead, she and Mrs. Wilkins sat up late in the kitchen, drinking tea and talking of lighter matters, deliberately avoiding mention of the danger Jed might be facing. Tommy had taken up a position on the porch, determined to keep watch despite Pedro's assurance that he would handle it. Shortly after midnight, it was Tommy's excited shout that brought them all outside. "Riders coming," he called, pointing to distant lantern light approaching along the main trail. Margaret's heart leapt to her throat as she strained to see in the darkness. Minutes that felt like hours passed before the riders came close enough to identify. Jed was at their head, seemingly unharmed. Beside him rode the Army lieutenant and 3 other men, one slumped in his saddle. "He's all right," Mrs. Wilkins murmured, patting Margaret's arm. "Thank the Lord." Jed dismounted quickly, passing his reins to Tommy before striding to Margaret. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You're safe," she breathed against his chest. "Told you wild horses couldn't keep me away," he replied, his voice rough with fatigue. Drawing back, he addressed the group. The Comanche broke into smaller bands, armies still tracking the main group, but these men need rest and supplies before rejoining them. "Of course," Margaret said, immediately shifting into her role as hostess. "Mrs. Wilkins, could you help me prepare food? Tommy, please show the men where they can wash up. Pedro, the injured man, just a graze," the lieutenant interrupted. "Private Miller got careless near a thicket." "Nothing serious, madam." Despite the late hour, Margaret and Mrs. Wilkins quickly assembled a meal while the men washed trail dust from their faces and hands. Over beans, bread, and coffee, the lieutenant explained that the Comanche had taken 2 horses and some supplies from the Franklin ranch, but no lives had been lost. "We'll head out at first light," he told Jed. "The main patrol should have them tracked by then. We'd appreciate the loan of fresh horses for the last leg." "You'll have them," Jed promised, "and supplies for the journey." When the meal was finished, Mrs. Wilkins organized sleeping arrangements, putting the soldiers in the bunkhouse with Tommy, while Pedro volunteered to keep watch through the night. She herself would take the small guest room that had been Margaret's until this night. As the house finally quieted, Jed took Margaret's hand and led her toward the master bedroom, their bedroom now. "Not exactly the wedding night I planned," he said apologetically as he closed the door behind them. "You're here and you're safe," Margaret replied, reaching up to touch his face. "That's all that matters." Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Margaret's head resting on Jed's shoulder, she marveled at the strange path that had led her to this place. 6 months ago, she had been a spinster schoolteacher in Boston, resigned to living out her days alone. Now she was Margaret Evans, rancher's wife, lying in the arms of a man who had seen past her deception to the woman beneath. "Penny for your thoughts," Jed murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I was just thinking how unlikely this all is," she admitted. "If someone had told me a year ago that I would be here now." "Life has a way of surprising us," Jed said. "When I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I never imagined finding someone like you." "Someone 20 years older than advertised, you mean," Margaret said wryly. "Someone perfect," Jed corrected, pulling her closer. "Age and all." The Army patrol departed at dawn as promised with fresh horses and provisions. Life at the Broken Spur gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though with the significant change that Margaret was now mistress of the house in fact as well as in name. She embraced her new role wholeheartedly, applying the same determination to mastering ranch skills that she had once devoted to teaching. Under Mrs. Wilkins' continued guidance, her cooking improved dramatically. She learned to manage the household accounts, to recognize the signs of illness in livestock, to preserve fruits and vegetables for the winter months ahead. By midsummer, Margaret had become a familiar sight in Leno, driving the buckboard into town for supplies, exchanging recipes with other ranchers' wives, even occasionally helping out at the small school when the teacher was ill. The initial curiosity about her marriage to Jed had faded, replaced by acceptance and, increasingly, respect for her capabilities and intelligence. One hot July afternoon, Margaret was working in the garden when Tommy came running from the corral, his face alight with excitement. "Mrs. Evans, there's a letter for you, all the way from Boston." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, accepting the envelope with surprise. It was indeed from Boston, but not from Elizabeth or any of her other regular correspondents. The return address belonged to the girls' academy where she had taught. Inside was a formal letter from the school's board of trustees, along with a personal note from the headmistress, Catherine Winters. "Dear Margaret, I hope this finds you well and happy in your new life. Your letters to Elizabeth have painted quite a picture of Texas ranching. I confess I can hardly imagine you in such surroundings, but she assures me you are thriving. The enclosed letter is self-explanatory, but I wanted to add my personal encouragement. The board's offer is genuine and heartfelt. Miss Hamilton's temporary appointment ends in December, and we have found no one of your caliber to replace her. The girls miss you terribly, as do the staff. Please consider returning to us, Margaret. Your position awaits you, with an increase in salary and the private apartment above the new library wing. I understand you have made commitments in Texas, but surely arrangements could be made for a temporary separation while you fulfill a final teaching term. With warmest regards, Catherine." The official letter contained a formal offer of employment for the spring semester, with terms more generous than any the academy had previously offered her. Margaret sat heavily on the garden bench, the letters trembling in her hands. Homesickness washed over her for the familiar streets of Boston, for her cherished books left behind, for the rhythms of academic life she had known for so long. She thought of her students, of the satisfaction of opening young minds to literature and ideas. She thought of Elizabeth, her dearest friend, whom she had resigned herself to never seeing again. She was still sitting there when Jed returned from checking the herd, his hat pushed back on his head, sweat dampening his shirt in the Texas heat. He spotted her immediately and changed course, concern crossing his features as he approached. "Margaret, what's wrong?" Wordlessly, she handed him the letters. He read them carefully, his expression unreadable. "They want you back," he said finally, returning the papers to her. "Yes." Margaret watched his face anxiously. "It's a very generous offer." Jed sat beside her on the bench, his hat in his hands. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "Part of me misses teaching. Mrs. Boston, it was my home for so long." She reached for his hand. "But this is my home now. You are my home." Jed was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. Finally, he looked up, his eyes clear and direct. "I won't stand in your way if this is something you need to do, Margaret. Even if it's just for a term to say a proper goodbye to that part of your life. You'd let me go." Margaret was stunned by his offer. "I'd hate every minute you were gone," he said frankly. "But I love you. I want you to be fulfilled, not just as my wife, but as the remarkable woman you are." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes at his selflessness. "Oh, Jed, What did I ever do to deserve you? You were honest when it mattered," he said simply. "You took a chance on a life you'd never known. You saw something in me worth leaving everything for." He squeezed her hand. "Take some time to think about it. Whatever you decide, we'll make it work." That evening, Margaret sat at the small desk in their bedroom, pen in hand, staring at the blank paper before her. Outside, the cicadas hummed in the oak trees, and the last light of day painted the hills with gold. From the corral came the sound of Jed and Tommy settling the horses for the night, their voices carrying clearly on the still air. She thought about what returning to Boston would mean, leaving Jed for months, missing the daily life they were building together. She thought about what staying would mean, closing the door on a career that had defined her for most of her adult life, never seeing her hometown or her oldest friends again. When Jed came in later, he found her still at the desk, but now a completed letter lay before her. "I've made my decision," she said, rising to meet him. And his voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I'm staying," Margaret said firmly. "This is where I belong now, Jed, with you on this land we're building together." The relief in his face was palpable. "Are you sure? I meant what I said about supporting whatever you decide." "I'm sure," she replied, "but I did write to Catherine with a different proposal. The school has always needed books. Their library is woefully inadequate. I've offered to help them establish a proper collection, to select titles and arrange purchases. I can do that from here, through correspondence." Jed pulled her into his arms. "That's a fine idea, the best of both worlds. And I've asked Elizabeth to visit us next spring," Margaret continued. "I want her to see our home, to meet you and understand why I've chosen this life." "I'll look forward to it," Jed said, meaning it. He knew how much Margaret's friend meant to her. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their room, Margaret felt a deep contentment settle over her. The path that had brought her to Texas had been unconventional, beginning with a deception she still regretted. But it had led her to a love and a life she would never have found otherwise. "Jed," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. His voice was drowsy but attentive. "Do you ever regret answering my letter, bringing me here even after you realized I wasn't what you expected?" "Never," he replied without hesitation. "Best decision I ever made." His arm tightened around her. "Do you?" "No," Margaret said softly. "Not for a single moment." Outside their window, the Texas night spread its star-filled canopy over the land they both loved, promising tomorrow and all the days to come, days they would face together, as partners, as equals, as two people who had found in each other not what they had sought, but what they truly needed. The years passed with the changing of seasons, scorching summers, mild autumns, brisk winters, and glorious springs. The Broken Spur prospered under Jed and Margaret's joint stewardship. They expanded the herd, added 2 more sections of land, and built a larger barn to replace the one damaged in a fierce storm during their 2nd year of marriage. Margaret's correspondence with the girls' academy evolved into a formal arrangement, with the school paying her a modest stipend to curate their growing library collection. Quarterly packages of books traveled from Boston to Llano, each carefully selected to enhance the school's curriculum and expand the students' horizons. In return, Margaret received letters from faculty and occasionally from students themselves, keeping her connected to the world of education she had loved. Elizabeth did indeed visit the following spring, arriving on the train with 6 trunks and a determination to understand her friend's new life. Initially skeptical of ranch living, she was gradually won over by the beauty of the hill country, the genuine warmth of the community, and most of all, by the obvious happiness radiating from Margaret. "I've never seen you like this," Elizabeth confessed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Jed and Tommy worked with a new colt in the corral. "You've always been content, Margaret, but now you're alive in a way you never were in Boston." "It's this place," Margaret said, gesturing to the landscape around them. "And it's Jed. He sees me, Elizabeth, not as a spinster schoolteacher, not as an aging woman, but as myself, my true self." Elizabeth stayed for 2 months, reluctantly returning to Boston only when her duties at the school demanded it. Her parting words to Jed remained with Margaret long after her friend's departure. "Take care of her, Mr. Evans. She may be the strongest woman I know, but she deserves to be treasured." "I intend to," Jed had replied solemnly. "Every day we have together," and he did. Through droughts that tested their resources and their resolve, through a Christmas blizzard that trapped them in the house for 3 days, through Margaret's bout with pneumonia that left Jed hollow-eyed with worry through it all, he remained the steady center of her world, just as she became the heart of his. They never had children of their own. Margaret's age made that unlikely from the beginning. But the ranch became a place where young people gathered and flourished. Tommy Wilson eventually married Clara Wilkins' daughter, building a small house on broken spur land and becoming Jed's foreman. Pedro's nephews joined the ranch crew as they came of age. Even Emily Porter, after finally marrying a cattle buyer from San Antonio, brought her children to visit when they came to town. 5 years after their wedding, on a crisp October morning, a wagon appeared at the ranch house. In it was a young woman with a baby, looking exhausted and desperate. "Please," she said when Margaret came onto the porch. "My name is Sarah Johnson. My husband was killed in a fall 3 months ago. I have nowhere to go, no family left. In town they said you might have work." Margaret brought her inside, fed her and the baby, and listened to her story. By the time Jed returned from the north pasture, she had made up her mind. "We need help in the house," she told him that evening as they discussed the situation. "I'm not as young as I used to be, and with the ranch expanding." Jed smiled, seeing through her practical reasoning to the compassion beneath. "You want to give her a home." "We have the space," Margaret pointed out. "The old bunkhouse could be converted into a small cabin for her and the baby. And Henry is such a sweet child." "Already named him, have you?" Jed teased, but his eyes were warm with understanding. "All right. She can stay with a fair wage for her work. We'll see how it goes." Sarah Johnson became part of the Broken Spur family, her capable hands making light work of household chores that had become increasingly difficult for Margaret as she entered her mid-50s. Little Henry took his first steps in the ranch house kitchen, spoke his first words to Margaret, and grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed Jed like a shadow whenever he could. When Sarah eventually remarried to a soft-spoken blacksmith from Lano, Jed and Margaret stood as witnesses at the ceremony. The couple built a home in town, but Henry continued to spend summers at the ranch, learning ranching skills from Jed and literature from Margaret. "He's like the grandson we never had," Margaret observed one evening, watching from the porch as Jed patiently taught the boy how to saddle a pony. Life settled into comfortable patterns, the days full and satisfying. Margaret's letters to Boston became less frequent but no less thoughtful. She found herself increasingly content with the rhythms of ranch life, with the changing of the seasons marked by different kinds of work, with the simple pleasures of a well-cooked meal shared with loved ones, or a book read aloud by the fire on winter evenings. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, Margaret woke to find Jed's side of the bed empty but still warm. Wrapping herself in a robe, she found him in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with unusual concentration. "What's this?" she asked, amused by his intense focus on what appeared to be biscuit dough. "Anniversary breakfast," Jed replied, looking up with a smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. "Mrs. Wilkins gave me her recipe, sworn me to secrecy. So I'm not allowed to watch," Margaret teased. "You are allowed to sit and be served," Jed corrected, pulling out a chair for her at the table, which she noticed was set with their best dishes and adorned with wildflowers. The biscuits were surprisingly good, light and fluffy, nothing like Margaret's early disastrous attempts. They ate leisurely, reminiscing about their wedding day and the years that had followed. "I have something for you," Jed said when they'd finished, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a delicate silver brooch in the shape of a Texas bluebonnet, the state flower that carpeted their land each spring. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, touching the finely crafted petals. "Had it made in San Antonio," Jed said, pleased by her reaction. "Wanted something as unique as you are." "I have something for you too," Margaret said, rising to retrieve a package from her sewing basket, "though it's not nearly as fine." Jed unwrapped the parcel to find a leather-bound book. Opening it, he discovered page after page of handwritten poetry, all the verses they had shared over the years, carefully copied in Margaret's elegant hand, interspersed with pressed flowers and small sketches of scenes from the ranch. "Margaret," Jed said, his voice rough with emotion as he turned the pages. I don't have words." "You don't need them," she replied softly. "Just know that every day with you has been a poem I never thought I'd be fortunate enough to live." Later that day, they rode together to the wildflower meadow Jed had shown her years ago during their courtship. It was autumn now, not spring, but the meadow had its own austere beauty, with golden grasses and the last wildflowers of the season nodding in the breeze. 10 years, Margaret marveled as they sat side by side on a blanket spread beneath an oak tree. "Sometimes it feels like we've always been together. Other times, it seems like only yesterday that I stepped off that train, terrified you'd send me straight back to Boston." "Best day of my life," Jed said simply, taking her hand in his. His own had grown weathered with years of ranch work, strong and capable. Hers showed signs of age, more prominent veins, a slight tremor sometimes when she was tired, but they fit together perfectly. "Even though I wasn't what you expected." It was an old joke between them now, the deception that had brought them together. "You were exactly what I needed," Jed replied, the familiar response still heartfelt after all these years. "Still are." As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in spectacular shades of orange and gold, they sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but partnership, friendship, and the deep understanding that comes from facing life's joys and challenges together. Margaret leaned her head against Jed's shoulder, thinking of the long journey that had brought her to this place from a spinster schoolteacher desperate enough to send a decades-old photograph to a stranger, to a woman secure in the knowledge that she was truly loved for herself. It hadn't been an easy road, but every step had led her here, to this moment of perfect contentment beside the man who had looked at her aging face that first day and said, with complete sincerity, "You're more beautiful in person." And in his eyes, she always would be.